The river of time. The river raged. Its dark waters swirled violently, crashing against the jagged rocks along the shore. Broken branches and fallen leaves drifted downstream, swallowed by the relentless current. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something heavier, something old, something inevitable. Thomas stood at the edge, his worn leather shoes sinking slightly into the mud. He watched as the water carried everything away, never pausing, never looking back. For a long time he had felt like one of those branches, helpless, at the mercy of something far greater than himself. Time had become his river, and it was pulling him along faster than he could comprehend. At 70 years old, Thomas was no stranger to loss. His wife Margaret had passed away 3 years ago, leaving their home unbearably empty. Their children, grown, successful, busy, visited when they could, but the days in between stretched long and silent. At first, he had filled the void with distractions, television, newspapers, long walks through the neighborhood. But at night, when the world quieted, fear crept in like an old friend. How many more mornings would he wake up alone? How many more nights would he spend staring at the key ceiling, counting the ticking seconds? How much time did he have left? He had tried to ignore the questions, but they pressed against him, whispering their cruel truths. His hands were weaker now. His back ached more. Some mornings he caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Thought had begun to haunt him. What happens when the river reaches the sea? Would he simply be swept away, forgotten, his life reduced to nothing more than a ripple on the surface? That morning, standing by the riverbank, he realized something. He was afraid, not just of dying, but of everything that came before it. The waiting, the loneliness, the slow erosion of all the things that made him him. A cold gust of wind rushed past, sending a few dry leaves tumbling into the water. He watched as they spun and twirled, helpless against the current. Is this what I've become? He wondered. Something waiting to be carried away. He clenched his fists. No. Somewhere deep within him, a stubborn ember still burned. He refused to believe that life, at this stage, was only about waiting for the inevitable. There had to be more. There had to be another way. And then a memory surfaced, something he had overheard at the local cafe weeks ago. A group of men around his age had been talking about a temple perched high on a hill at the edge of town. A place where an old monk, wise and serene, was said to have the answers to life's most difficult questions. At the time, Thomas had dismissed it as idle chatter, but now, standing here, with the weight of time pressing down on his shoulders, he found himself wondering, could this monk help him understand? Could he teach Thomas how to face the river instead of being afraid of it? For the first time in years, something stirred inside him. Curiosity, hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way to face the river. Maybe he didn't have to let it carry him away. With nothing but a small bag and a restless heart, Thomas turned away from the water and began walking toward the distant hills where the temple waited. He had no idea what he would find there, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was. He had to find another way to live, and so his journey began. The origin of fear and anxiety, the shadow in the mind. The temple was silent, save for the distant sound of wind chimes swaying in the breeze. The wooden beams above creaked softly, as if whispering secrets of time itself. Thomas sat cross-legged, on the cool stone floor, his back aching from the unfamiliar posture. But his mind ached far more. He had traveled all this way seeking answers, yet now, sitting before the old monk, he found himself struggling to put his thoughts into words. The monk, wrapped in simple saffron robes, watched him with eyes that had seen decades pass like seasons. There was no urgency in his gaze, no pressure, just quiet patience. Finally, Thomas exhaled. "I don't know why I feel this way," he said. "I wake up every morning with this weight on my chest. It's like something is following me, always just behind me. I can't enjoy the things I used to. I can't sleep without thinking about how little time I have left. It follows me everywhere. This fear." The monk nodded slowly. Then he lifted his hand and pointed toward the ground beside Thomas. "Do you see it?" he asked. Thomas glanced down, confused. "See what?" "Your shadow," the monk said simply. Thomas frowned. He looked at the long, dark silhouette stretching beside him. It was such an ordinary thing, something he had never paid much attention to. Yet now, under the monk's gaze, it unsettled him. "It follows you wherever you go," the monk continued. "It moves as you move, lingers where you linger. But if you turn toward the sun, you will no longer see it." Thomas stared at his shadow, his mind working to grasp the meaning behind the monk's words. "What does that have to do with my fear?" he asked. The monk smiled gently. "Fear is like your shadow. It is not something outside of you. It is something created within you. The more you focus on it, the larger it becomes." A quiet breeze drifted through the temple, rustling the old prayer flags that hung from the ceiling. Thomas remained silent, his thoughts tangled. "What is it that you fear the most?" the monk asked. Thomas swallowed hard. He had spent years avoiding that question, locking it away in the depths of his mind, but here, in the presence of this man who seemed to see straight through him, he had no place to hide. "I fear the end," he admitted. "I fear dying. I fear being forgotten. I fear losing control over my body, over my mind. I fear waking up one day and realizing my life has passed me by, that I wasted it worrying about things I couldn't stop." The monk nodded as if he had heard these words 1,000 times before. "Let me tell you a story," he said. Thomas listened, drawn in despite himself. "There was once a man who feared death so much that he could not sleep. Every night, as soon as he closed his eyes, he imagined his last breath, his body turning cold, his existence fading into nothingness. He convinced himself that if he stayed awake, he could somehow delay it. And so, night after night, he fought sleep, his mind racing with dread. But something strange happened. The more he tried to avoid death, the less he truly lived. His days became empty. He could not enjoy food, because he feared it might be his last meal. He could not laugh, because laughter reminded him that time was slipping away. He could not love, because love meant loss. His fear of dying had stolen his ability to live. One night the man was so exhausted that he could not fight sleep any longer. And in that moment, just before he drifted off, he had a realization. It is not death that takes life from us, but fear of it. The moment he surrendered to rest, he truly lived for the first time in years. The monk fell silent, letting the weight of his words settle in the air between them. Thomas felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, like the first crack in a frozen lake, but it was there. "Fear is a thief," the monk said finally. "It does not take your future. It takes your present. Every moment you spend consumed by it is a moment you are no longer truly living." Thomas let out a slow breath. "So what should I do?" he asked. The monk gestured toward the open courtyard, where the afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the temple floor. "Turn toward the light," he said. "Do not let your mind cast its own shadow. When you live in the present, fear loses its power over you. It is only when you look too far ahead or hold too tightly to the past that fear can grow." Thomas turned, his gaze toward the sunlight, watching as the temple's prayer flags fluttered in the wind. His shadow was still there, but now he understood. It had only ever been in his mind. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest felt just a little lighter. The falling leaves. Thomas sat beneath the great Bodhi tree, feeling the rough texture of its bark against his back. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and the distant aroma of burning incense from the temple. A golden leaf detached, itself from a high branch, twisting and turning as it drifted to the ground. Then another, and another. The tree shed its leaves without hesitation, without resistance, as if surrendering to the cycle of life without regret. The monk sat beside him, silent for a long time, simply watching the leaves descend. Thomas followed his gaze, mesmerized by the quiet beauty of it. A gust of wind rustled the branches, sending more golden fragments spiraling through the air. He thought about how, just a few months ago, these same leaves had been green, vibrant, full of life, and now they fell one by one, returning to the earth. The monk reached out and picked up a single leaf, turning it between his fingers. "Do you see this, Thomas?" he asked gently. Thomas nodded, unsure of what to say. "This leaf has no fear of falling," the monk continued. "It does not cling to the branch, nor does it mourn the summer days when it was full of life. It lets go because it knows this is the way of things." Thomas felt a tightness in his throat. The monk placed the leaf on his palm and let the wind carry it away. "Tell me, Thomas, if a leaf can accept change, why do we resist it so much?" Thomas lowered his gaze. He knew the answer before he even spoke. "Because we don't want to lose what we love." The monk nodded. "And yet, whether we want to or not, change comes. Health fades. People leave. Time moves forward, never back. We suffer, not because things change, but because we believe they should not." A deeper gust of wind swept through the temple grounds, and another flurry of leaves danced in the air before settling into the soil. Thomas watched them, feeling something shift inside him. He had spent so much of his life resisting the inevitable, dreading the loss of his youth, fearing the day his children no longer needed him, grieving for the wife who was no longer by his side. But now, looking at the tree, he saw something he hadn't before. It did not fight the wind. It did not cling to its leaves. And yet, it was still strong, still standing. The monk's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Let me tell you a story." Thomas turned his attention back to him, listening. There was once a small bird who spent days building a nest high up in the branches of a great tree. It gathered the softest feathers, the strongest twigs, weaving them together until it had created the perfect home. The bird felt safe there, warm and protected from the dangers of the world. But one night, a great storm came. The wind howled. Through the trees the rain fell in torrents, and by morning the nest was gone. The little bird was devastated. It had worked so hard, had poured so much of itself into that home. For a moment it felt lost, helpless. But then, as the morning sun rose, the bird spread its wings and took flight. It had forgotten something important. The monk turned to Thomas with a gentle smile. It still had its wings. Thomas inhaled, sharply. He could see it so clearly, the tiny bird perched on a bare branch, trembling at first, then taking off into the open sky. The nest was gone, but it was free. The bird could have spent the rest of its days mourning what it had lost, the monk continued, but instead it remembered what it had all along, its ability to fly. Thomas felt the words settle deep into his bones. How much time had he wasted clinging to the past? How many days had he spent mourning things that had already drifted away? He had been so focused on what he had lost that he had forgotten what remained. His wife may have passed, but the love they shared still lived inside him. His children may have their own lives, but he still had the memories of watching them grow. His body may be aging, but he could still walk, still breathe, still be. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man desperately holding on to something slipping through his fingers. Instead, he felt like the bird standing on the edge of a branch, realizing it had wings. The monk stood, brushing the dust from his robes. "Come," he said, "let us walk." Thomas hesitated, then rose to his feet. As they stepped away, another gust of wind swept through the temple grounds, carrying the fallen leaves away. He watched them go, and instead of feeling sorrow, he felt something else. Peace. The sound of the wind. Chime. The temple's wooden veranda creaked under their footsteps as Thomas followed the monk toward the farthest corner of the courtyard. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden streaks across the stone floor. In the quiet of the late afternoon, a soft melodic sound echoed through the air, a wind chime swaying gently from the eaves of the temple roof. The monk stopped beneath it, his hands tucked into the folds of his robe. He tilted his head slightly, listening. Thomas followed his gaze, watching as the metal tubes shimmered in the light, their hollow bodies catching the wind, producing a delicate, ringing sound that seemed to melt into the air itself. The monk turned to Thomas. "Tell me, what do you hear?" Thomas hesitated, then answered, "The chime, but only when the wind moves it." The monk's lips curled into a knowing smile. "And if the wind stops, then the sound disappears," Thomas replied. The monk nodded. "Our minds are much like this chime. Thoughts, worries, anxieties. They come and go, just like the wind. But do you see? The chime does not make noise on its own. It only responds to what moves it. So why do we allow our minds to be stirred by every passing gust? Thomas blinked. The simplicity of the thought struck him. For years, he had let his mind be tossed about like a leaf in a storm, reacting to every worry, every memory, every fear. But what if he didn't have to? What if, like the chime, his mind could be still, silent unless truly needed? The monk stepped forward, reaching out to steady the chime with his hand. It ceased its ringing immediately, hanging still and quiet. You cannot stop the wind, the monk said, but you can choose whether or not to be moved by it. Thomas swallowed. How? The monk gestured for him to sit. Breathe, he instructed. Just breathe. Thomas did as he was told, drawing in a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air expand his lungs. Feel it, the monk said softly. The air entering your body, the weight of your feet against the floor, the warmth of the setting sun on your skin. Do not follow your thoughts. Just be here. Thomas tried. At first, his mind resisted. It darted to memories of his wife, to thoughts of his children, to the familiar fear of time slipping through his fingers. But each time he brought himself back, to his breath, to the sound of the chime, to this moment. Minutes passed. He wasn't sure how many. Slowly, something inside him began to shift, like sediment settling at the bottom of a still lake. He could feel the thoughts still there, lingering like clouds in the sky, but they no longer pulled at him. They were just passing. The monk spoke again, his voice no louder than the rustling of the trees. There was once a man who walked through a dense forest. He was terrified of getting lost, so he kept looking ahead, trying to recognize landmarks, worrying about which direction to take. His fear consumed him, making every step uncertain, every path a question. But then something changed. He stopped looking too far ahead. He stopped worrying about what came next. Instead, he focused on each step beneath his feet. The feel of the earth, the sound of the leaves crunching, the rhythm of his own breathing. And when he did, he realized something. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer lost. He was simply walking. Thomas sat with those words. The monk pointed at the chime again. The wind will always blow, Thomas. Thoughts will always come. But we do not have to follow every breeze. We do not have to let our minds be carried away. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the truth of that settle into his bones. His fears had not vanished. The past was still the past. The future was still uncertain. But for now, in this moment, as he sat in the fading sunlight with the sound of the chime ringing softly in his ears, he was simply here. And that was enough. Letting go. The raft on the river. The river stretched wide before them, its surface shifting between calm ripples and restless currents. Thomas and the monk stood at the edge of the water, their robes and clothes swaying gently in the morning breeze. A few feet away, a wooden raft bobbed up and down, drifting slowly downstream. The old planks, bound together by thick rope, creaked as they floated along, carrying nothing but time itself. The monk gestured toward the raft. Look at it, Thomas. It was built with care, meant to carry someone across this river. But what happens when it reaches the other side? Thomas watched as the raft drifted further, its presence growing smaller as the current pulled it along. The traveler steps off, the monk continued, and leaves the raft behind. He does not carry it with him into the forest. He does not strap it to his back. He lets it go. The monk turned to Thomas, his voice gentle but firm. Tell me, Thomas, why do you carry what no longer serves you? Thomas inhaled deeply, his chest tightening. He didn't need to ask what the monk meant. He had carried his past like a burden for years. Old regrets, missed opportunities, moments that could never be rewritten. He had replayed them in his mind over and over, like a man clutching at the edges of a dream that had already faded. I don't know how to let go, he admitted. His voice was quieter than he had expected. The monk crouched down, picking up a small rock from the riverbank. It was smooth, polished by the water's endless touch. He held it out in his palm. There was once a man, he said, who found a beautiful stone unlike any he had ever seen. It sparkled in the light, and he loved it dearly. He carried it with him everywhere, afraid that if he set it down, it would be lost forever. Thomas watched as the monk slowly closed his fist around the rock, but time passed and he grew tired. His hands ached, his arms weakened. He wanted to reach for other things, to embrace his loved ones, to work, to rest, but he could not. The monk opened his hand, letting the rock drop back to the ground. He had spent so long holding on to the stone that he had forgotten how to use his hands for anything else. The river gurgled beside them, the sound weaving itself into the silence between them. Thomas swallowed hard. How much had he missed because he had been clinging to something that no longer existed? He had spent years holding on to the past, his youth, the life he had built with Margaret, the dreams that had never come true, and because of that he had not lived fully in the present. His wife was gone, but her love remained. His children were grown, but their lives were not separate from his own. His body was aging, but it still carried him forward step by step. The monk spoke again, his voice softer now. "The past is a raft, Thomas. It was necessary. It helped you cross to where you are now, but it was never meant to be carried beyond the river." Thomas let out a slow breath. His fingers unclenched. The weight on his shoulders, so long familiar, felt just a little lighter. For the first time he looked at the river not as something that carried things away, but as something that had carried him forward. The meaning of old age. Candles in the night. The room was dimly lit, the scent of sandalwood and old parchment hanging in the air. Thomas sat across from the monk in the temple's meditation hall, where shadows stretched long against the wooden walls. Before them a single candle flickered on a low wooden table, its flame dancing gently with the draught. The monk, in his quiet way, reached for another candle, unlit, and held it between his fingers. "Tell me, Thomas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is darkness stronger than light?" Thomas furrowed his brows. "No," he said, after a moment. "Even a small flame can push back the dark." The monk smiled, then leaned forward and touched the unlit wick to the burning flame. Instantly a second candle came to life, its glow warm and steady. "Many people think of old age as the coming of night," the monk said. "They fear it as if it is the end of something, the closing of a door. But look, does this flame shine any less brightly just because it has been burning for a long time?" Thomas watched the two candles, their light now intertwined, feeding off the same fire. The warmth of the moment settled deep within him. "You see, Thomas, your years are not a loss, they are a light," the monk continued. "Every moment you have lived, every joy, every sorrow, every lesson, they have all fed the flame within you. And now, it is your time to share that light with others." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. He had spent so much time fearing what was to come, mourning what had already passed, that he had forgotten what was still here, what he still had to give. The monk continued, his voice steady and calm. "There was once a man who dreaded growing old. He saw his reflection in the mirror and grieved for the youth he had lost. Every wrinkle on his face, every silver strand in his hair, he saw as proof that time had taken something from him. But, one day, his grandson sat beside him and touched his weathered hands. "Grandfather," the boy said, "tell me a story from when you were young." The old man hesitated at first, but then he spoke. And as he did, he saw the wonder in his grandson's eyes. He saw how his stories shaped the child's heart, how his wisdom guided his family, how his presence alone brought comfort to those who loved him. In that moment he realized something. His years had not taken from him. They had given him something greater. His wrinkles were not marks of loss, but of lessons. His grey hair was not a sign of decay, but of experience. His old age was not an ending, but a gift. The monk paused, watching as Thomas absorbed the story. "You are not fading, Thomas," he said softly. "You are shining." Thomas swallowed hard. He thought of his wife, of his children, of the people in his life who still looked to him. He thought of all the things he had seen, the love he had known, the wisdom he had gathered. He was not a man waiting for the night to consume him. He was a candle that still burned. And in that moment he decided he would not waste the light he had left. Turning toward the light, the river stretched endlessly before him, its surface reflecting the soft hues of dawn. The water moved as it always had, carrying leaves and branches downstream, never pausing, never hesitating. Thomas stood at the edge, feeling the cool morning air against his skin, the damp earth beneath his feet. He had stood here before, but everything felt different now. The fear that had once clenched his chest like an iron grip was gone. He no longer saw the river as something waiting to consume him, to drag him helplessly into the unknown. It was simply water, moving, flowing, changing, just as life always had and always would. Beside him, the monk stood in silence, watching. The rising sun bathed the landscape in golden light, stretching their shadows behind them. The gentle sound of the temple's wind chime drifted through the air, a quiet reminder of everything Thomas had learned. The monk finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. "Do you still fear what lies ahead, Thomas?" Thomas let out a slow breath. He had asked himself that question so many times before, but now, standing here, he realized he no longer needed to. He turned to face the monk, a small, knowing smile on his lips. "No," he said, "because I have learned how to live." The monk nodded, his expression holding nothing but quiet understanding. There was nothing more to say. Thomas looked back toward the sun, watching as its golden light spilled over the river, over the trees, over everything. He thought of all the years he had spent running from the inevitable, clinging to the past, fearing what was to come. He had mourned the loss of his youth, the passing of time, the fading of things he once held so tightly. But now he understood. Nothing had truly been lost. Everything had simply changed, just as it was meant to. He thought of the falling leaves beneath the Bodhi tree, of the wind chime that only made sound when the wind moved it, of the raft that had once carried a traveler across the river, but was never meant to be carried beyond it. He thought of the candle that had burned brightly, not in spite of the years that had passed, but because of them. For the first time in his life, he felt no need to resist the current. He did not fear the passing of time, nor the uncertainties of the future. He had spent too many years chasing after things that had already drifted away, or grasping for things that had not yet arrived. But now in this moment, he was simply here, and that was enough. The monk stepped away, leaving Thomas alone with the river, the wind, the light. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, listening to the steady rhythm of his own breath. He had spent so long fearing the shadows, but he understood now. Shadows only existed when one turned away from the light. And so, as the morning unfolded before him, Thomas made his choice. He turned toward the light. A message. For you, life moves like a river, always flowing, always changing. The past drifts away and the future remains uncertain, but the present, this moment, is where life truly exists. Fear, regret, and worry are like shadows. They grow when we turn away from the light. But when we live fully, when we embrace each moment without clinging to what has passed or dreading what is to come, we find peace. No matter where you are in life, remember this: you are not fading, you are shining. Every day, every experience, every lesson has made you who you are. Let go of the burdens that no longer serve you. Turn toward the light and let the shadows fall behind. Take a deep breath. Feel the present moment. This is where life happens. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to take a moment to reflect. Practice mindfulness, find joy in the simple moments. And most of all, do not let fear steal the time you still have to live. Let us walk this journey together. If you found wisdom in these words, consider supporting this channel by liking, sharing, or subscribing. Your presence here is a gift, and I am grateful to share this space with you. May you always walk toward the light.